They stood on their porches, watching her drag a suitcase through the snow, and someone laughed, saying, "She's homeless." Minutes later, police lights flooded the street, neighbors pointing as if she didn't belong in the house she owned. They questioned her job, her money, her right to be there while she stood silent on her own doorstep. Then on Christmas night, she opened the door again, and the man holding her hand changed everything they thought they knew. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes over Greenwood Hills, softening the edges of million-dollar homes and manicured hedges, as if nature itself were trying to make the neighborhood look kinder than it was. Christmas Eve had settled in with a quiet confidence here, the kind reserved for places that believed trouble was something that happened elsewhere. Warm yellow lights glowed behind wide windows, wreaths hung perfectly centered on polished doors, and every driveway told a story of comfort that had never been questioned. It was into this carefully protected stillness that Serenity Vaughn arrived, dragging a single dark suitcase behind her, boots crunching against fresh snow that had not yet been disturbed by anyone else walking on foot. She moved steadily, not rushed, not hesitant, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Her breath fogged the air in front of her, but her face remained composed, focused forward, as if she could already feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing into her back. She had learned long ago what that feeling meant. Greenwood Hills was not built for women who looked like her to arrive alone, on foot, on Christmas Eve. It was built for couples stepping out of SUVs, for families unloading matching luggage, for people whose presence never required explanation. Serenity knew this, but she also knew something else. She belonged here just as much as anyone else, even if no one believed it yet. Behind the drawn curtains of the first house she passed, a woman paused mid-sip of her wine and leaned closer to the glass. Her gaze narrowed, curiosity quickly hardening into suspicion. A black woman. A suitcase. No car. No familiar face. The woman murmured something to her husband, who joined her at the window, his expression shifting from indifference to mild concern, then to something sharper. Across the street, another set of curtains moved. A porch light flicked on, though no one stepped outside. Serenity felt it all without turning around, the collective tightening of a neighborhood that had decided she was a problem before she had taken 10 steps. The whispers began quietly, passed from living room to living room through texts and hushed conversations. Someone suggested she might be lost. Someone else said she looked strange for the area. Then the word landed, heavy and decisive, as if it explained everything. Homeless. It was said with certainty, the kind that came from never having to imagine another possibility. No one considered that she might live here. That thought did not fit the rules Greenwood Hills had followed for decades. Serenity adjusted her grip on the suitcase handle as she reached the end of the block. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she welcomed the sensation. It kept her grounded. She had flown in that morning, rented a car, then chosen to walk the final few blocks to feel the place before claiming it. It was her first home purchased entirely on her own, a victory she had not announced to anyone in this neighborhood, because she wanted it to be quiet, private. She hadn't anticipated how loudly her presence alone would speak. She stopped in front of a 2-story colonial, with white pillars and a red door adorned with a simple evergreen wreath. The house stood dark, except for a single light glowing in the upstairs window, a timer she had set weeks earlier. Serenity reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a set of keys, and unlocked the door without hesitation. She stepped inside, closing it gently behind her, sealing herself off from the stairs and the assumptions, at least for a moment. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and fresh paint. Boxes were stacked neatly along the wall, labeled in her handwriting. She set her suitcase down and leaned against the door, exhaling for the first time since she'd arrived. The house was empty but not cold. It felt patient, as if it had been waiting for her. Serenity smiled despite herself, already imagining Christmas morning here, imagining peace. She did not know that peace had already been denied to her by people who had never even spoken to her. Across the street, the woman with the wineglass frowned. "She just walked in," she said quietly, confusion edging her voice. "That house has been empty for months." Her husband didn't answer right away. He was already scrolling on his phone, pulling up the neighborhood association group chat, typing with the kind of urgency reserved for perceived threats. Within minutes, the chat lit up. "Who is she? Does anyone recognize her? Should we call someone?" Someone posted a blurry photo taken through a window, Serenity's back visible as she closed the door. The assumption hardened into action. One neighbor, emboldened by the reassurance of others, agreeing with her fear, picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency police number. She described Serenity as a suspicious individual, possibly trespassing, possibly homeless, possibly dangerous. She emphasized the suitcase, the fact that Serenity had arrived alone, the fact that it was Christmas Eve. The dispatcher asked a few neutral questions, but the call had already done its damage. A report was logged. A patrol car was assigned. Inside her house, Serenity moved slowly, savoring each step as she walked through rooms she had only seen in listing photos before. She ran her hand along the banister, opened a window slightly to let in the cold air, grounding herself in the reality of the space. She placed a small tabletop Christmas tree on the counter and plugged it in, watching the white lights flicker to life. For a moment she allowed herself to feel proud. She had earned this. She had survived enough to deserve this. Then she heard it. The distant sound of tires crunching over snow, growing closer. At first she dismissed it. Greenwood Hills was quiet, but cars still passed. But when the sound stopped directly outside her house, her chest tightened. Serenity walked to the front window and parted the curtain just enough to see the unmistakable reflection of flashing lights, painting the snow in red and blue. Her stomach dropped, not from fear of wrongdoing, but from the familiar exhaustion of being questioned simply for existing. She stood still, debating her next move, already knowing the rules she would have to follow. Be calm. Be polite. Don't give them a reason. The knock came moments later, firm, official, echoing through the quiet house. Serenity closed her eyes briefly, centering herself, then opened the door. Two officers stood on her porch, their expressions neutral but alert. One of them glanced past her into the house, as if searching for evidence of a crime already decided. Serenity greeted them evenly, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions pressing against her ribs. They explained they'd received a call about a possible trespasser. The word hung in the air between them, absurd and heavy. Serenity listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening as she realized how quickly she had been turned into a suspect. She told them this was her home. She offered to get her identification, her paperwork. The officers exchanged a look that said they were unconvinced. Not because of anything she'd done, but because of everything she represented in their eyes. One of them asked how long she'd been there. Another asked where she'd come from. Each question carried an unspoken challenge, as if they were waiting for her story to fall apart. From the sidewalk, a few neighbors had gathered, pretending to walk dogs or check mail, their eyes fixed on Serenity's doorway. She could feel their curiosity sharpening into satisfaction, as if the police presence confirmed what they had already decided about her. Serenity became acutely aware of how exposed she was, standing in her own doorway under flashing lights, turned into a spectacle on the very night she had hoped to feel at home. She went inside to retrieve her documents, every step measured, aware that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. When she returned, papers in hand, the officer barely glanced at them before asking another question, his tone shifting from procedural to personal. Serenity answered anyway, her patience thinning but her resolve holding. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The snow continued to fall, quiet and relentless, as the situation stretched on longer than it should have. And just as Serenity thought the officers might finally accept the truth, one of them lifted his radio and spoke into it, requesting additional units to verify the property ownership. The words landed like a blow, signaling that this was far from over. As the sound of another patrol car approached in the distance, Serenity felt the weight of the night settle fully on her shoulders. What had begun as a silent walk home had turned into a public trial, and she knew, with chilling clarity, that this was only the beginning. Officer Tim Hargrove had answered hundreds of calls like this over the years, the kind that slipped into the night shift quietly and left just as easily. Dispatch had used careful language: possible trespassing suspect, homeowner concern, approach with caution. The phrases chosen not because evidence demanded them, but because anxiety had. Chestnut Lane sat inside Greenwood Hills like a promise of order, the sort of place where crime reports were rare enough to feel personal when they did occur. Tim drove slower than usual as he turned onto the street, his headlights sweeping across pristine lawns and symmetrical facades, each house appearing exactly where it belonged. The red and blue lights reflected softly off the snow, unnecessary yet unavoidable, announcing his presence before he even stepped out of the car. From the curb, the scene didn't add up. There were no broken windows, no forced door, no sign of a struggle or hurried entry. The front porch light glowed warmly, and through the window he could see a woman moving calmly inside, placing ornaments on a console table with deliberate care. It was not the behavior of someone breaking in. Tim felt a flicker of hesitation, the part of his training that urged him to reassess. But then his eyes lingered on her. Black, alone, in a house that neighbors had already decided wasn't hers, and the hesitation dissolved into something more rigid. He adjusted his belt, stepped out of the car, and approached the door with the posture of authority rather than curiosity. Serenity opened the door before he knocked, her movements controlled, her expression composed in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this moment her entire life. She met his gaze evenly, offering a polite greeting that landed flat against the weight of his uniform. Tim introduced himself, explaining the call, watching her closely for signs of deception that never came. The house behind her looked lived in already, despite the boxes still lining the wall. A small lit Christmas tree glowed on the counter, the kind of detail that should have ended the interaction immediately. Instead, it became irrelevant. He asked for identification. Serenity handed it over without protest, her fingers steady. He studied the card longer than necessary, then asked if she could step outside while he verified a few things. The request was framed as routine, but it carried an expectation of compliance. Serenity felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the calculation of how to respond without escalating a situation she had not created. She stepped onto the porch, the cold biting through her coat, aware of the neighbors watching from a distance, their interest sharpened by the sight of her now standing beside a police officer. Tim asked where she was coming from, his tone casual but probing. Serenity answered simply, explaining she had just arrived from the airport and was settling in for the night. He nodded, then asked where she worked. The question hung there, unnecessary and intrusive, a quiet test disguised as small talk. Serenity answered again, her voice calm, even as she recognized the shift from investigation to judgment. She could feel herself being measured against an invisible standard she had not agreed to, one that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with perception. From across the street, a woman stepped closer, pretending to adjust her scarf while clearly listening. Another neighbor stood near his mailbox, phone raised just enough to capture the scene without being obvious. Serenity resisted the urge to look at them, knowing that any reaction would be interpreted as guilt. Tim noticed them too, felt the unspoken pressure of an audience that expected him to validate their fear. The longer the moment stretched, the harder it became for him to simply walk away. Serenity excused herself briefly and stepped back inside, returning with a folder she had kept close since the purchase. Inside were documents she had reviewed dozens of times, memorizing every line not because she doubted their validity, but because she anticipated moments like this. She handed Tim the deed, pointing out her name, the address, the closing date. It was clear, official, irrefutable. For a split second, something like surprise crossed his face. That second passed. Tim scanned the paper, then looked back at Serenity, his expression resetting into something guarded. Instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging the mistake, he asked another question. How long she planned to stay. The absurdity of it hit Serenity like a physical force. She answered anyway, stating plainly that this was her home. Tim nodded again, folding the paper carefully, handing it back as if it were merely a piece of supporting evidence rather than the conclusion itself. He turned slightly, speaking into his radio in a low voice, requesting confirmation from dispatch. Serenity watched him, the realization settling heavily in her stomach that the proof she had offered was not enough. It never was. The issue was no longer whether she belonged in the house, but whether she belonged in the neighborhood. And that question she knew could not be resolved with paperwork. Tim asked her to wait while he verified the information. The phrase was polite, but the implication was clear. She was not free to go back inside her own home. She stood there as minutes passed, the cold seeping deeper, the quiet punctuated only by the distant hum of another engine approaching. The neighbors shifted closer, their interest now fully justified in their minds. Serenity could see it in their posture, the way suspicion had turned into confirmation. The presence of police was proof enough. Inside the house, the Christmas lights continued to glow, visible through the window behind her, a small, stubborn reminder of the life she was trying to build here. Serenity focused on them, anchoring herself to something warm and familiar. She thought of the years it had taken to reach this point, the sacrifices that had gone unseen, the resilience that had been demanded of her long before she stepped onto this street. None of that mattered now. All that mattered was how she was being seen. Tim returned to her side, his jaw set. Dispatch was still verifying the information, he said. He suggested calling additional units just to be safe, his voice neutral, as if safety were a shared concern rather than a coded justification. Serenity felt a flash of anger rise, sharp and immediate. But she swallowed it, knowing the cost of letting it show. She asked calmly if there was any reason to doubt the documents she had provided. Tim did not answer directly. He said procedure required thoroughness. The second patrol car pulled up moments later, lights flashing, cutting through the night with renewed intensity. Serenity's heart sank as the street filled with movement, the quiet dignity of her arrival now fully erased. She could hear doors opening and closing, neighbors murmuring to one another, the collective hum of attention swelling. What had begun as a single call born of prejudice had now transformed into a spectacle sanctioned by authority. As the additional officers stepped out of their vehicle and approached, Tim gestured toward Serenity, summarizing the situation in clipped tones. She listened, standing still, her face composed even as her sense of safety fractured. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about how easily a life could be interrupted, how quickly a place meant to be home could become hostile. One of the new officers glanced at the deed, then at Serenity, his expression unreadable. He asked Tim a question in a low voice, and Tim responded with a shrug that said more than words ever could. Serenity realized then that the apology she deserved was not coming. Instead, the night was deepening, and the assumptions that had brought them here were being reinforced with every passing second. As Tim lifted his radio again, requesting yet another verification step, Serenity understood that the call that shouldn't have happened had set something irreversible in motion. And as the officers began discussing next steps just feet away from her, she sensed that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything she had prepared for. The street no longer looked like Christmas Eve. What once shimmered with garlands and fairy lights now pulsed under the oppressive flash of red and blue, breaking apart the silence that once blanketed Greenwood Hills. The snowfall had slowed to a lazy drift, flakes clinging to the roofs and police hoods like dust settling after a disturbance. 4 patrol cars now boxed Serenity's home like a crime scene, their engines humming in sync like a chorus of suspicion. Nothing about it felt procedural anymore. This was a performance, not for justice, but for the comfort of neighbors who had never wanted to share their space with someone like her. Children pressed their faces to frosted windows, watching wide-eyed. Parents stood behind them with folded arms and whispering mouths, pretending to monitor a situation they had created. And in the middle of it all, Serenity Vaughn stood on her own front porch, her breath curling out in defiant clouds, her hands no longer shaking but folded tight against her chest. It was colder now, but the chill that settled into her spine wasn't from the weather. It came from the slow, creeping awareness that every part of her identity was being interrogated in real time. Officer Tim Hargrove leaned against his cruiser, chewing over words like he didn't quite know how to say what he meant. 2 other officers had taken over the conversation, younger and more aggressive in their posture, approaching her like a suspect, and not a homeowner. One of them, Officer Daly, circled around to her side with a tight smirk and a clipboard, asking questions that had nothing to do with the law. "So, this your house?" he asked, tapping the clipboard with his pen. The question was rhetorical now. He had seen the deed, the ID, the utilities bill Serenity had printed in preparation for her move. But his tone was laced with disbelief, the kind that clings to bias even when facts are shoved in its face. "Yes," Serenity replied evenly. "As I've already explained several times." Daly raised his eyebrows, flipping to a blank page. "Mind if I ask what you do for a living?" He said it like it was a casual curiosity, but there was something venomous just beneath it. Must be a pretty good gig to land a place in this neighborhood. The question slammed into her like a slap, precisely because of how ordinary it sounded. How often had that exact line been weaponized as a gatekeeper, as a way to measure whether someone had the right to exist in a certain zip code? "I'm a creative director," she answered slowly, her voice cool and professional. "I run national campaigns. I work with global brands. I pay my taxes. I have no criminal record, and I own this house legally." Daly didn't write anything down. He just nodded with that same smirk, as if all her credentials only made her more suspicious. Another officer, this one older and more methodical, stepped forward next. "Forgive the questions, ma'am. We're just doing our job," he said with an air of forced politeness that felt rehearsed. "You can understand why people would be concerned, right?" Serenity turned to him, her eyes sharp, voice still calm but unmistakably steel beneath it. "No, I can't understand why people would be concerned by a black woman walking into her own home with a suitcase." The officer stiffened, caught off guard by the bluntness, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he looked away, giving the silence permission to stretch a little longer, awkward and heavy. The other officers murmured among themselves, flipping through printed records and confirming details that had already been proven. Serenity could hear them talk in low tones, the word afford surfacing again and again like a hook they couldn't let go of. Not whether she had a mortgage, but whether she deserved one. Not whether she belonged here, but whether someone like her ever could. The street had turned into a slow-burning humiliation chamber. She could feel her dignity unraveling in front of neighbors who were using every moment to confirm their prejudice. Her silence was not weakness, it was survival. But inside, a storm churned. Not of rage, not yet, just the painful knowing that this was not an anomaly. This was America, dressed in snowflakes and subtle hatred. Then the tension took a new shape. A sleek gray SUV turned onto the street, coasting slowly past the parked patrol cars before pulling into the driveway of the house directly across from hers. Serenity's eyes narrowed the moment the door opened. Out stepped a woman in her early 50s, wrapped in a camel trench coat, blonde hair pulled tight in a bun that radiated authority. She moved like someone who was used to being listened to before she spoke. Susan Whitmore, president of the Greenwood Hills Homeowners Association. Serenity's breath caught in her throat. Not out of surprise but recognition. 3 days earlier, they had crossed paths in the most unremarkable of places, a grocery store 15 minutes from here. Serenity had been in line at the self-checkout, counting through a stack of clipped coupons and scanning items one by one. Susan had been behind her, visibly irritated, shifting weight from one designer-booted foot to another, sighing loudly, and then finally muttering, "Some people just don't know their place." It had been loud enough to hear, too quiet to call out. The kind of microaggression that was always designed to linger, never confront. Now here she was, smiling tightly at the officers, waving off the situation like she had authority to define it. "Evening, officers," she said, voice bright. "I'm the HOA president. I believe there's been some confusion." The cops immediately straightened. One of them stepped forward to shake her hand. Susan gestured toward Serenity without even looking her in the eyes. "I live just across the way. We've had that home vacant for quite a few months, so naturally when we saw someone new entering without notice, we called it in. Safety first, you understand." Serenity didn't speak. She didn't need to. The layers of insult sat between them like broken glass. Without notice, as if neighbors needed to approve her existence. Safety first, as if her presence was danger incarnate. Tim Hargrove looked between the two women, discomfort clear in his stance now. The facts were in. There was no crime. But the power Susan carried wasn't about facts. It was about perception. She didn't accuse Serenity of anything outright. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, her subtle framing, was a second interrogation masquerading as neighborly concern. Then Susan finally turned to her. "I'm sure this was all a misunderstanding," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We just weren't expecting company. Welcome to the neighborhood." Serenity held her gaze, not blinking, not smiling. There was nothing left to say in that moment that wouldn't be twisted or dismissed. The officers, sensing the moment had passed, began quietly wrapping up. Daly gave a final nod, still looking at Serenity like she was a riddle he couldn't solve. Tim returned her ID with a curt, "Thank you for your cooperation," and with that the red and blue lights finally began to fade from the street. But even as the patrol cars began to reverse out of the cul-de-sac, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was recoil. The neighbors had seen all they needed. So had Susan. And Serenity knew it. As she turned to walk back into her home, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from her sister. But it wasn't. It was a notification from a neighborhood group thread she hadn't even realized she'd been added to. She clicked it. The top post read, "Just a heads up. A strange woman has moved into 430 Chestnut. Police already had to show up. Hopefully this doesn't become a pattern." And the first comment below it? "Post is by Susan Whitmore." Serenity's fingers hovered over her screen. Because something about Susan's comment wasn't just racist. It was personal. She used Serenity's exact address. But that detail had never been made public. 7 days before patrol cars clogged Chestnut Lane, and the neighborhood exposed its quiet hostility, Serenity Vaughn had already endured a different kind of humiliation. One with no flashing lights. Only the dull hum of grocery store speakers playing Christmas jingles. The upscale market on the edge of town was meant to feel welcoming, clean, and curated for shoppers who wanted their produce organic and their interactions polite. But that illusion shattered the moment Serenity noticed she was being followed. She had come in for a few things: almond flour, rosemary, a bottle of maple syrup, and wore nothing but her favorite wool peacoat and cream-colored beanie. Still, the moment she entered, the manager, tall, gaunt, with a name tag that read Brett, began trailing her like she'd tripped an invisible alarm. He lingered near her at every turn, pretending to rearrange items, hovering too long in aisles where she browsed. Serenity didn't acknowledge him, but her pulse quickened. It was a familiar rhythm, the quiet surveillance she had learned to recognize even as a child. She moved with purpose to self-checkout, placed her items carefully on the scale, and reached for her coupon envelope, each one clipped and sorted from last week's circular. She had barely scanned her third coupon when Brett stepped in front of the machine like a bouncer. "Ma'am, I'll need to see those," he said loud enough to turn heads. The air stiffened. Serenity looked up, startled. "Is there a problem?" "We've had trouble with stolen coupon codes," Brett said, folding his arms. "Just need to verify them. I clipped them from last Sunday's paper." He didn't budge. Store policy, nothing personal. But it was personal. It always was. Reluctantly, she handed over the envelope. Behind her, two other customers leaned forward, intrigued. Brett rifled through her coupons like they were evidence. He called over an employee who stared blankly, then nodded as if confirming a code red. Serenity stood still, her cheeks flushed not from guilt but shame. A practiced humiliation that was happening yet again, in real time, in front of strangers. And then came Susan Whitmore. She appeared beside Serenity as if summoned by scent, pushing a pristine cart, and wearing the smug elegance of someone used to being obeyed. Susan didn't acknowledge Serenity. Instead, she addressed Brett with concern wrapped in sugar. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her tone casual but clearly performative. "Oh yes," Brett replied quickly. "Just verifying some things." Susan turned to Serenity, finally acknowledging her with a faint smile. "Sometimes things get mixed up." Serenity blinked. "Excuse me?" Susan feigned confusion. "No offense. It just looked like there was a situation." Serenity's voice sharpened. "Would you say the same thing to someone else using coupons?" Susan's laugh was short, tight. "You're making this into something it's not." "No," Serenity said, staring her down. "I'm making it into exactly what it is." But Susan didn't respond. She simply walked away, pushing her cart like the confrontation never happened. Brett returned the coupons moments later. "Thanks for your patience," he said, as if she should be grateful he found nothing wrong. Serenity walked out without a word, but she stopped once she reached her car. She pulled out her phone and typed one sentence into her notes app. Susan Whitmore, grocery store. December. She wanted to remember, because these were the moments that built quietly in her bones. This one wouldn't fade. Now, a week later, there she was again. Susan Whitmore standing in Serenity's driveway, wearing that same smug calm, acting like their grocery store encounter never happened, pretending this was just another community misunderstanding. But Serenity remembered everything, every glance, every microaggression, every coded phrase. And this time Susan had made a fatal error. Because as the cops questioned her and Susan played her part, Serenity had done what many black women had learned to do in hostile spaces. She recorded. With her phone angled subtly from her coat pocket, she captured the entire interaction. Susan's tone, the way the officers asked about her job instead of her rights, how the questions subtly shifted legal to personal. As soon as she stepped back inside her home, she uploaded the clip to TikTok with a caption that said everything. "When being black in a rich neighborhood equals 4 patrol cars and a HOA president at your door." The video blew up in minutes. Her following tripled. The views exploded into the hundreds of thousands. Comments flooded in, supporting her composure, her courage, her restraint. But amid the chaos of going viral, one direct message stood out. It was from a verified profile. The name read C. Westbrook. The message said only, "I've seen your video. I know exactly what this feels like. Let's talk." Serenity stared at the screen. She didn't recognize the name, but something about the timing, the simplicity, the confidence, it all felt different. Before she could respond, her phone lit up again, not with a new message, but with a notification from the same neighborhood group thread she'd seen the night before. The post read, "Just a heads up. A strange woman has moved into 418 Chestnut. Police already had to show up. Hopefully this doesn't become a pattern." And beneath it, the first comment came from Susan Whitmore. But what made Serenity freeze wasn't just the condescension, it was the detail. Susan had listed Serenity's exact address, an address that hadn't been made public. Her stomach turned, because if Susan had access to that kind of information, Then what else had she been watching? And before Serenity could even process it, her phone buzzed again, this time with a link from a teenage neighbor. A live video, streaming on Instagram. The caption read, "My neighbors called the cops on a black lady for moving in. But y'all won't believe what the HOA lady did after the cameras left." Serenity tapped play, her heart thudding, unaware that what she was about to see would unravel everything Susan had tried to hide. By the time the first rays of December morning pushed through the gauzy curtains of Serenity's front window, her world had changed entirely, and the internet had already decided what side it stood on. Her phone buzzed non-stop, vibrating against the nightstand like an alarm she didn't set. Serenity blinked herself awake, still in yesterday's clothes. The weight of the night before pressed deep into her spine. But when she reached for her phone, her drowsiness dissolved instantly.
3 million views.
That number sat at the top of her TikTok like a banner headline. Her video had torn through the algorithm, hitting every For You page from Atlanta to Seattle. The hashtags, while black, racial profiling, home while black trended overnight. The comments poured in faster than she could scroll. Hundreds of thousands of people had seen her standing in her doorway, calm and composed, surrounded by flashing police lights while a white woman in pearls feigned concern. Some called her a hero. Others called her a symbol. But all agreed, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was racism, weaponized with a clipboard and a neighborhood watch thread. Clips of Susan's smug tone and Officer Daly's probing questions were sliced and stitched into reaction videos. Duets filled with disbelief, outrage, solidarity. Lawyers stitched it with advice. Black homeowners stitched it with their own eerily similar stories. White allies posted stunned apologies, writing long captions about their own privilege. Within hours, the moment Serenity had quietly recorded as a form of protection had become a movement. She was no longer alone, but not all attention was kind. Among the flood of support came another stream, quieter at first, but rising fast. Anonymous comments calling her a race baiter, claims that she had set up the incident for attention. Someone found an old LinkedIn profile from her advertising days and posted her employment history. A local forum thread popped up with the title "The Real Story Behind the Chestnut Lane Drama." The narrative there was different, more venomous. Posters claimed she had baited the cops, acted smug, and used race as a weapon. Serenity sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, watching her notifications flutter like confetti. She didn't speak. She barely blinked. The firestorm outside her door had now invaded her phone, her inbox, her life. She had gone viral, but she had also become a target. She closed the app and opened Instagram. Hundreds of DMs waited, some encouraging, others vile. She skimmed without reacting, scanning for anything real, anything grounded. That's when she saw it. A message request from a verified account. No profile picture, no description, just the initials. Her finger hovered over it. The message preview read, "I've seen your video. I know exactly what this feels like. Let's talk." Curiosity surged, but caution answered first. Serenity clicked open the message fully. The full text was brief, calculated and deliberate. "I've been where you are. I've built where you're standing. And I don't believe in letting people like that win. You're not alone. I'd like to help." There was a number attached, followed by 3 simple words. "Christian Westbrook here." The name didn't register right away. Serenity tilted her head, reading it twice. But something about the certainty in the message, its lack of desperation, its clarity, stood out. This wasn't someone seeking to co-opt her moment. This was someone who had already lived it. Curious. She Googled the name. The results exploded instantly. Christian Westbrook, age 38, CEO of Westbrook Systems, a tech empire specializing in cybersecurity and privacy AI. Forbes 30 Under 30 alum. TechCrunch keynote speaker. Net worth 8 figures. But what caught Serenity's eye wasn't the wealth. It was the headlines buried underneath. Tech mogul sues Huawei after racial harassment in Silicon Valley. Christian Westbrook on building without permission. Billionaire boycott. Why Westbrook refuses to build in white gated communities. She clicked through articles, interviews, clips of him speaking at conferences. Calm. Measured. Brilliant. But underneath it all, wounded. Someone who had clearly weathered storms, not unlike her own. The deeper she scrolled, the more intrigued she became. And still, doubt lingered. Why her? She returned to his message, rereading it again. The phrasing wasn't performative. It wasn't fishing for likes. It felt like it had come from a place of lived anger, quiet, calculated, and intimate. Still, Serenity didn't reply. Instead, she set the phone down and exhaled deeply, letting her gaze wander across the unpacked boxes scattered across the living room. Her house, her safe space, no longer felt untouched. It felt exposed. It had taken one night for the neighborhood to show its teeth, and now the world knew it too. There was no going back. The idea of quietly settling into Greenwood Hills had evaporated with every retweet. The doorbell rang, Serenity startled, spine snapping straight. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her stomach twisted. She peered through the peephole cautiously. A box sat on the porch, plain, brown, unmarked. She opened the door slowly, eyes scanning the street. No one. She bent down, picked up the box, and brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. No note, no return address, just her name, Serenity Vaughn, typed on a small white sticker. She opened it. Inside was a small black device, a sleek, rectangular piece of tech that looked like something out of a spy movie. Beneath it, a folded note. Plug it in. It protects your network from digital surveillance. I've seen how far they'll go. Let me help. CW. Serenity's heart kicked hard in her chest. Someone had found her address. Again, someone had gone beyond social threads and hashtags. The online harassment was real, but someone had gone offline, and the timing couldn't be a coincidence. She looked at the device, unsure whether it was a gift or a threat. She turned it over in her hand, then set it down carefully. Her thoughts were spinning. Christian Westbrook, whoever he was, knew more than she'd told anyone. And he wasn't wrong. The ugliness she faced wasn't going to stay confined to comment sections and whisper campaigns. People were already digging. People were already watching. Her phone buzzed again. This time a screenshot from her younger cousin in Atlanta. A post from a local Greenwood Hills forum had surfaced, one Serenity hadn't seen. In it, a neighbor named Kevin Marks had posted a photo of her house from across the street. The caption read, "We tried to be polite. This isn't what our neighborhood stands for. Don't say we didn't warn y'all when property values start dropping." Attached was a comment by none other than Susan Whitmore. "We're looking into new HOA guidelines ASAP. This can't happen again." Serenity's vision blurred with rage. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was coordinated. They were trying to force her out. Before she could even move, her phone rang. No caller ID, just a number. Hesitation clung to her fingers as she answered. "Ms. Vaughn," the voice said, crisp and direct. "I'm calling on behalf of Christian Westbrook. He'd like to speak with you." Privately. Serenity opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "Don't worry," the voice continued. "He doesn't want press. He doesn't want clout. He's been where you are, and he's serious about helping. If you'll meet him." Serenity gripped the phone, heart thudding louder than ever. "What does he want in return?" she asked finally, voice low. The voice paused, then answered with surprising softness. "Just that you don't stop speaking. People like them count on your silence." Serenity looked out the window, and across the street, Susan was watching her again. Only this time she wasn't alone. A suited man stood beside her, clipboard in hand, and he was pointing directly at Serenity's house. The man behind the mysterious initials, CW, wasn't just some distant sympathizer or curious onlooker. Christian Westbrook was a force, someone who had once been the story and now quietly controlled the narrative. In boardrooms, his name carried weight. In Silicon Valley, it carried legend. But in Serenity's inbox, it arrived with precision. A man of means, yes, but more importantly, a man who had already survived the very machinery that was now trying to crush her. It wasn't until Serenity agreed to a meeting that the magnitude of his presence fully settled into her bones. She chose the location, a modest downtown cafe, on the quieter edge of the city, intentionally unglamorous, intentionally neutral. She didn't want to be impressed. She wanted answers. And yet, the moment Christian stepped through the door, shoulders squared, suit casual but impossibly tailored, everything shifted. He didn't walk like someone trying to dominate a room. He walked like someone who'd already decided which parts of the world he no longer needed to explain himself to. Tall, smooth-skinned, with short, tightly coiled hair and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that made his eyes sharper than his voice. Christian greeted Serenity with neither hesitation nor pity. He simply said, "It's good to meet you in person," and pulled out the chair across from hers like he had all the time in the world. For a moment she said nothing. She just watched him. She had come prepared to be guarded, even cynical, but his presence disarmed her, not because he was wealthy, or well-spoken, but because there was no trace of spectacle in how he looked at her. No savior complex, no rehearsed empathy, just a quiet, measured intensity. "I saw your video in Dubai," he began, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of black tea. "Airport lounge. I was supposed to be on a call, but I didn't move until it ended." She nodded slowly. "And then you reached out." Christian tilted his head. "Because I've lived it. Not with 4 squad cars and a HOA president breathing down my neck, but enough to know how deep this thing goes. They don't just want you out of the house. They want you erased from the memory of it." Serenity exhaled through her nose, surprised by how precisely his words cut to the bone. "You're not wrong." He leaned forward. "You didn't just go viral, Serenity. You cracked a system they've spent decades building. And now that you've exposed it, they'll get louder. They'll dig deeper. They'll find ways to turn you into the problem." She stared at him. "So why you? Why care?" Christian didn't blink. "Because I know what it's like to win on paper and still lose in rooms where your skin is the first line of negotiation." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was loaded, charged with the quiet recognition that their stories, though different in detail, were stitched from the same cloth of resistance. "Let me guess," she said. "You want to help me build a platform, raise awareness, maybe get a sponsorship deal?" Christian smirked. "I'm not here to turn you into a brand. You're already a movement. I'm here to give you infrastructure." She narrowed her eyes. "Infrastructure?" He nodded. "Legal defense, digital security, surveillance countermeasures, access to people who owe me favors. Not charity, strategy." It was the first time in days Serenity felt the weight on her chest shift, just slightly. Christian didn't offer rescue. He offered preparation. And in that cafe, amid the clink of dishes and soft hum of conversation, something between them solidified. Not romance, not yet, but alignment. A shared understanding born of collision with the same invisible wall. Their conversation moved seamlessly from tech to law to housing codes, to the subtle art of existing while black in a space that resented your presence. Christian spoke of how he had bought a home in a gated community only to be reported by neighbors for lingering near his own mailbox. How he'd fought and won a lawsuit that changed the way HOAs could access resident data. Every story mirrored Serenity's in tone, if not detail. She wasn't alone. And now she wasn't unarmed. When the check came, he insisted on paying. "Not because you're a woman," he said, amused. "Because next time you'll cover it with your settlement check." Serenity laughed softly. For the first time in days, he stood to leave, but paused. "And one more thing," he said, sliding a slim envelope across the table. "It's a gift, but it's also a challenge." Inside was a document, a title transfer. Serenity blinked. It was a deed, for a property. A lot right next to hers. "I just bought the empty house beside yours," Christian said, calm as ever. "So if Susan and her crew think this is going to be easy, they're about to have a very long year." Serenity looked up, stunned. "You didn't." "I did. But why?" "Because they already decided you're not supposed to be there. Imagine what they'll do when they realize they now have 2 of us." The implications hit her like a wave. This wasn't just defense. This was escalation. Serenity shook her head, equal parts awe and disbelief. "This is bold." Christian grinned. "You'll learn. I don't play small." Back in Greenwood Hills, however, the game had already shifted again. While Serenity met with Christian, across the cul-de-sac, Susan Whitmore wasn't watching TikToks or reading headlines. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a man in a gray suit, one hand on a thick binder, the other typing into a tablet. "What we're proposing," he said, "is a temporary emergency policy that allows the HOA to request additional background checks for any new residents who generate 3 or more complaints within a 14-day period." Susan's eyes gleamed. "Can we expedite that?" "Already filed the motion," the man replied. "We just need you to sign off at the next board meeting." "And the police?" Susan asked, voice low.
They're already documenting any and all calls tied to 41E Chestnut. We're building a pattern.
Susan folded her hands. "Good. Let her think she's won. She won't see it coming." But what Susan didn't know, what no one in Greenwood Hills knew, was that Serenity had just agreed to something else entirely. Because that evening, hours after the cafe meeting, she received a secure email from Christian's office. It contained a full legal strategy, a private investigative report on HOA bias, and something else, an open invitation to join a federal lawsuit already in motion against discriminatory homeowner practices across the country. It wasn't just about her anymore. Serenity clicked open the final attachment and froze. A list of names. Not anonymous. Not hidden. Susan Whitmore's was on it. And at the very bottom of that list, under sealed evidence, was a photo from years ago of Susan Whitmore at a different address, standing behind a police officer during a nearly identical trespassing call. And the woman in that photo wasn't Serenity. It was someone else entirely. Black, frightened, and never seen in Greenwood Hills again. The letter arrived folded neatly in Serenity's mailbox, hand-delivered with no stamp, no return address, just a Greenwood Hills HOA header embossed across the top. She didn't need to open it to know it reeked of Susan Whitmore's fingerprints. Still, she unfolded it with slow precision at her kitchen counter, each line confirming what she already suspected: a formal complaint filed against her for unauthorized renovations and excessive use of social media that damages the character and tranquility of the neighborhood. The hypocrisy stung worse than the paper's stiff edge. Serenity hadn't even installed a light fixture. The only renovation was a seasonal wreath and a doormat that read "Black joy is not a threat." But what the letter was really accusing her of wasn't physical. It was presence. Unapologetic, visible presence. It was about the footage of her poised voice against a line of patrol cars. About the millions of people who now knew Serenity Vaughn's name, and not for the reasons the neighborhood had hoped. Her house had become a symbol, and that, to them, was the real violation. She dropped the letter onto the counter, her pulse steady. Christian was across the table, watching her closely. He had seen this tactic before. When power couldn't shut you up, it tried to shrink you, reframe your very existence as disruptive. He offered to forward it to his legal team, to bury Susan in enough cease and desist filings to make her HOA presidency implode. But Serenity shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "This fight isn't about legal loopholes. It's about showing up, staying visible. I want them to look me in the eye when they tell me I don't belong." Christian studied her, admiration etched behind his concern. "You know this isn't going to stop at letters." "I'm not expecting it to," he exhaled, nodding. "Then let's make them uncomfortable in ways they haven't even imagined." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "Like what?" Christian leaned forward, eyes lit with a mischievous calm. "What if we stopped playing defense? What if we flipped the narrative?" Serenity narrowed her gaze. "Go on." "We throw the biggest Christmas gala this neighborhood's ever seen. At your house." She blinked. "You want me to throw a party?" "Not just a party," he corrected. "An event. Cameras. Press. Influencers. Invite the city council, the NAICP, even the local real estate board. Make it impossible for them to pretend this story is isolated. Let them choke on their decorum while standing in the same room they tried to erase you from." Serenity looked away, staring out the frosted window toward the same porch where Susan had stood days earlier, dripping with fake grace. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the countertop. "A gala," she repeated slowly. Christian smiled. "Your presence is already protest. Let's make it celebration too." The planning began that afternoon. Invitations were custom designed, sleek, gold-trimmed cards with embossed script that read, "You are cordially invited to the first annual Greenwood Hills Winter Unity Gala." Each invite ended with a simple phrase, "Hosted with love by Serenity Vaughn and Christian Westbrook." The neighborhood buzzed within 24 hours. Some RSVP'd out of curiosity, others out of suspicion. Susan, of course, did neither. But that didn't stop the whispers. Rumors rippled through Chestnut Lane like a new virus. "Did you hear? She's throwing a gala. He's buying more property. This isn't what our community was built for." Serenity ignored it all. Instead, she focused on transforming her home into a space of joy, resilience, and undeniable belonging. She worked alongside caterers, decorators, and a sound crew that Christian flew in from Chicago. The living room was cleared for a makeshift dance floor, the backyard tented in clear vinyl with heaters, chandeliers, and a custom ice sculpture in the shape of two hands, one black, one white, interlocked in solidarity. Every detail was intentional. Not for vanity, for meaning. As the gala approached, Serenity posted teaser clips, snippets of the band rehearsals, glimpses of the custom menu, voiceovers narrating her journey. Her audience swelled to nearly 4 million, but so did the threat. An anonymous email came in warning her not to go through with it. A letter slid under her door one night. "We're watching. You've made your point. Leave." Her trash cans were overturned twice, each time nothing stolen, just scattered like a warning. Christian doubled the security detail, installed motion-activated cameras, and reassured her. They're scared, he said softly. Not of what you're doing, but of who you're becoming. The morning of the gala, Serenity stood in her bedroom, staring at herself in the mirror. Her dress was a deep emerald green, floor-length silk that hugged her with quiet grace. Her hair was styled in soft waves, makeup minimal, power radiating from every angle. This was not the woman they had labeled suspicious. This was not the woman they had tried to profile or push out. This was a woman who was not just staying, she was redefining the soil beneath their feet. Guests began arriving as twilight set in. Black sedans, luxury SUVs, city cars, people from every rung of her life, activists, tech leaders, neighbors from outside Greenwood Hills, who brought flowers and hugs and promises of protection. And there were some from the street itself, who came not with hostility, but hesitation, perhaps sensing the tide was turning, perhaps curious if it really could. Inside, the air was electric. Laughter swirled with jazz melodies. Trays of hors d'oeuvres passed by as guests mingled beneath twinkling lights. Journalists roamed discreetly, cameras clicking, pens scribbling notes. And then, inevitably, Susan arrived. Not as a guest, she appeared just outside Serenity's fence, standing with arms folded, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a local zoning official. Her expression was unreadable, but her message was clear: she hadn't come to join. She had come to observe, to collect evidence, to intimidate. Christian noticed first. "She's here," he said, nodding toward the front yard. Serenity didn't flinch. Let her watch. But then something unexpected happened. A cheer rose from the living room as a surprise guest entered, a local state senator, known for her work in housing equality. She hugged Serenity like a sister and posed for photos beside the ice sculpture. Moments later, the head of the city's Human Rights Commission stepped inside. Outside, Susan's face paled. Christian walked over, calm but deliberate, and stepped past the gate. "Evening, Susan," he said. "You didn't get a permit for this size of gathering," she said sharply. "There are HOA guidelines." He held up a document, the permit in question, stamped and signed by the city. "Actually, we did." Susan opened her mouth, but Christian cut in smoothly. "You know what this really is? It's a community reminder that the world's changing, and it won't wait for your comfort to catch up." She didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her heels crunching hard against the sidewalk. Inside, Serenity stood near the window, watching her go. Her heart wasn't light, but it was steady, unshaken. The music swelled, the lights dimmed slightly for the evening toast. Christian raised a glass to presence, to dignity, and to the power of never asking permission just to be. The crowd erupted in applause, clinking glasses, dancing, celebrating a night that had started as resistance but ended as triumph. But just as Serenity let herself smile, her phone buzzed in her clutch. A single notification. From the neighborhood forum. The post read, "Enjoy your party while you can. Tomorrow we take it to court." And attached to the post was a screenshot of a private investigator's report, suggesting Serenity's purchase of the home may be under review. The next morning, Serenity sat at her breakfast nook, staring at the glowing screen of her phone. The neighborhood forum post was still up, pinned by a moderator. The attached screenshot from a private investigator suggested something utterly ludicrous: that her home purchase might be under review due to possible irregularities in the sale process. It didn't accuse her outright. It did something worse. It implied doubt, legitimacy, ownership, worthiness, all quietly, professionally, and with enough room for deniability if things got ugly. Christian had told her this would happen. When visibility turns to threat, institutions move in behind the curtain. When fear couldn't control her, paperwork would. They weren't attacking her front door anymore. They were trying to reach her foundation, the one with her name on the deed. But Serenity didn't flinch. She sat straighter, closed the app, and picked up the stack of heavy gold embossed envelopes on the counter. Each one had been personally addressed, calligraphy swirling over pristine ivory cardstock. They were invitations, not mass emails, not evites, not social media blasts. These were deliberate, luxurious, and deeply unsettling for a neighborhood that had tried to box her out. She had mailed every one herself. The gala wasn't just an event anymore. It had become the line in the sand, and every name on those envelopes had to choose where they stood. Most of her neighbors didn't respond. Some RSVP'd with a curt "no thank you" scribbled across the return card. And one envelope came back shredded and taped shut, remailed to her with no return address. But Serenity didn't stop. She'd been ignored before. That didn't deter her. It ignited her, because beneath all the silent refusals, Something else was happening. Curiosity was leaking through the cracks. The rumor mill in Greenwood Hills was always humming. But now it sang. A black woman throwing a formal winter gala? A millionaire boyfriend living next door? Whispered gossip morphed into speculation. She must be using him, someone wrote on Facebook. It's clearly a PR stunt, another replied. Probably trying to land a reality show deal, a third chimed in. They couldn't make sense of Serenity's confidence, so they tried to reduce it. They couldn't handle her presence, so they tried to explain it away. Still, she pressed on. The tent went up in her backyard 2 days before the event. It was clear paneled with gold frames, chandeliers suspended from every corner, and rows of lanterns glowing like stars above the heated flooring. The rental company she hired was stunned when she requested 4 custom-built fireplaces to be installed. Cozy, but cinematic, she said. The menu was curated by a Michelin-starred chef who owed Christian a favor. There were live musicians, florist flown in from Charleston, a string quartet tucked into the foyer, and a dessert station that resembled a winter garden. She spared no expense, not to impress them, but to confront them, because this party wasn't for celebration. It was for reckoning. Christian watched from the sideline, stepping in when needed, respecting the fact that this battle had Serenity's name on it, not his. She didn't ask him for permission. She didn't lean on his resources. She built this with deliberate hands, fueled, not by revenge, but by clarity. Every detail whispered, I belong here, not because you approve of me, but because I don't need you to. As the final table settings were polished and candles arranged in crisp lines, her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from a local news outlet, Metro Observer 5. A reporter named Kayla Dominguez had messaged her direct, Hi Serenity. I've been following your story closely. I saw the HOA thread and the recent viral video. Word on the street is you're hosting something major this weekend. I'd like to cover it. With your permission, of course. Serenity tapped the message and read it again. Christian looked over from the fireplace setup. Problem? No, she said slowly. Then looked up. A reporter wants to cover the gala. He raised his eyebrows. That was fast. She nodded. They smell a storm. Christian shrugged. Good. Let them feel the thunder. Serenity paused before replying to Kayla. She wasn't naive. Media coverage could turn sharp in an instant. A supportive narrative could be twisted. Her voice could be edited. Her intention misframed. But this time she wasn't hiding. And the city deserved to see what survival looked like when it dressed itself in elegance and style. She responded with one sentence. Come. But bring your camera. Word traveled quickly. By the next morning, RSVP confirmations doubled. Not from the neighbors, but from beyond the gates. Creators, activists, artists, public defenders, city officials. The guest list swelled from a projected 50 to over 200. The neighborhood panicked, but Serenity didn't. She printed extra programs, hired 2 more valet drivers, upgraded the sound system. Because they weren't just coming for a party, they were coming to witness. Susan, however, hadn't RSVP'd, not once, but Serenity had kept a separate invitation aside. Handwritten, personalized, and the day before the gala, she walked across the street and slipped it directly into Susan's gold mailbox. No note, no smile, just the gesture. That night, the tension across the neighborhood stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Susan stood behind her living room curtain for hours, watching the tent light up. The trucks unload, the crew hustle. Her face didn't show rage. It showed calculation, because Susan wasn't used to losing control. And now the woman she had dismissed as a nobody had turned their cul-de-sac into a headline, and possibly into history. The next morning, Serenity woke to a knock at the door. Not loud, measured. She opened it and found a gift basket on the stoop, orchids, lavender oil, and a sleek black envelope tucked beneath the ribbon. Inside was a card, typed, no name. Don't forget where you are. This neighborhood has a long memory. She read it twice, her jaw clenched. This wasn't fear. It was theater. A threat disguised as etiquette. She took the basket inside, dumped the contents into the trash, and texted the security team to double-check the guest list. But even as the pressure mounted, the excitement began to eclipse the fear. The day of the gala arrived like a storm dressed in diamonds. The sky was powder blue, the air sharp but dry, and by 5 p.m., black sedans began to snake their way through the front gate. Guests stepped out in gowns, tuxedos, traditional wear, cultural patterns, Head wraps, heels and fur coats. Some clutched tickets, others clutched phones, already recording, already streaming. The front lawn was lined with lanterns. A red carpet stretched down the sidewalk. At the entry, an arch of winter white roses framed the door. It was breathtaking, intimate, and unmistakably powerful. Susan, from her window, watched in silent fury, but then something she didn't expect happened. Two elderly neighbors, Tom and Mildred, who had lived on Chestnut Lane since 1982, crossed the street and approached Serenity's house. They weren't invited, but they were dressed, and they had brought a bottle of wine. Serenity greeted them herself. "We weren't sure," Mildred said nervously, "but we've never seen anything like this, and it feels important." Serenity smiled. "It is," and with that the first neighbors stepped inside. By 7 p.m. the party was in full swing. Champagne flutes clinked. The quartet played Nina Simone. A spoken-word artist recited a piece about redlining and roots. Guests danced, mingled, cried. It was not just an event, it was testimony. And just as Serenity stepped toward the stage to make her welcome speech, Kayla, the reporter, waved from the side with her camera rolling. "We're live in 3. Serenity stepped up to the mic, her voice calm and bright. "Welcome to my home," she began. "Not because I need you to witness it, but because I refuse to let it be hidden." Applause erupted. Flashbulbs sparked. And then, right in the middle of it all, her phone buzzed again. A direct message, from an account she didn't recognize. But the name sent a chill down her spine. "Kevin Marks. We need to talk, before they find out what really happened." Serenity froze, because Kevin was one of the neighbors who hadn't spoken to her once. And his name was now tied to a new complaint, one that could undo everything. Christmas night arrived with a hush, the kind of silence that only comes after snowfall. The world momentarily softened, hushed under a blanket of white. But inside Serenity Vaughn's home, the atmosphere pulsed with warmth, motion, and the electricity of something uncontainable. The gala had taken on a life of its own, growing from an act of defiance into something far more sacred, a statement carved into the frozen surface of Greenwood Hills. Tonight wasn't just about Serenity's survival. It was about her radiance. Outside, luxury cars slid slowly into the driveway, tires crunching over the snow-packed curb. A valet team, discreetly dressed in black coats, greeted each guest with nods and opened doors with white-gloved hands. Christian Westbrook stepped out of the lead vehicle, the fabric of his tailored wool coat catching the lamplight like armor. He wasn't flashy, but every detail was deliberate. The crisp fold of his trousers, the gold cufflinks shaped like circuit boards, his hand, unwavering and warm, wrapped around Serenity's as he helped her out onto the glowing carpet of lantern light that led up the walkway. Serenity's gown flowed behind her like smoke, deep green silk that moved like memory, not fashion. Her posture was effortless, but not apologetic. This was her house, her night, her territory. The murmurs began the second they stepped in together. Gasps, not of admiration, but disbelief. Even those who had RSVP'd out of pressure rather than interest couldn't hide their surprise. Serenity Vaughn wasn't hiding. She was glowing. Inside, the scent of slow-roasted lamb, spiced root vegetables, and fresh rosemary filled the air. Soulful jazz hummed from a trio set up in the corner of the living room, their upright bass and saxophone twining like smoke around the conversations starting to build. Warm lighting bounced off crystal glasses and flickered gently across the walls, highlighting curated photographs from Black American history that Serenity had hung intentionally. Baldwin, Nina Simone, Thurgood Marshall, and Shirley Chisholm, watching over the room like silent witnesses. The neighbors who came reluctantly found themselves stunned. Tom and Mildred, who had never seen Serenity without judgment clouding their gaze, now stood by the punch bowl in silent awe, whispering over their glasses about the decor, the art, the elegance. "I didn't expect it to be," Tom trailed off, lost for words. "This nice?" Mildred whispered sharply. He didn't respond. And then there were those who hadn't even tried to mask their disdain before. Their faces taut, arms folded. They leaned against doorways or sipped wine with forced smiles, their discomfort seeping into every glance. These weren't just people reluctant to be there. They were waiting to be proven right, waiting for Serenity to stumble, for the music to be too loud, for some guest to act out of line, for any crack in her poise to confirm that her presence was temporary, her elegance borrowed. But Serenity gave them nothing. She moved through the room like a conductor, not drawing attention, just guiding energy, greeting guests with warmth. not performance. Laughing with the quartet between songs, checking in with the catering team. She wasn't just hosting, she was owning every inch of this night. It wasn't perfection she sought, it was presence, and that made her untouchable. Near the fireplace, Christian spoke with city officials and a representative from the Human Rights Commission. A journalist snapped photos, careful not to be intrusive. The footage from earlier in the evening had already hit Twitter, drawing national attention. Serenity's name was trending again, but this time attached to words like elegance, legacy, and unbothered. At the far side of the room, however, sat Susan Whitmore, uninvited but determined, nursing a single glass of white wine like it was her armor. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was loud in its defiance. She watched every interaction, took mental notes, lips pressed tight. She was losing control, and she knew it, but Susan didn't come to be seen. She came to gather. Then, just before dessert, Christian stepped forward. The music faded gently. Conversations hushed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence had already quieted the room. With a glass of champagne in his hand, he offered a calm nod to the crowd. "I want to thank you all," he began, "for showing up, especially those who didn't want to." A ripple of nervous laughter stirred through the room. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others smirked, caught off guard by the honesty. "This night," he continued, "isn't about me. And it's not just about Serenity. It's about every door that was meant to be shut. Every system built to push people like us out. And what happens when we walk in anyway." Serenity stood near the staircase, watching him with stillness in her eyes. She didn't know what he was going to say. He hadn't rehearsed a speech, but something in his posture told her that the moment was about to shift. "I've spent most of my adult life building things," Christian said. "Companies, teams, solutions. And I thought I understood what power was. But then I watched that video of Serenity standing in her doorway, being questioned for existing, and I realized something." He paused, setting his glass on a nearby table. "Real power," he said, "is refusing to disappear." The room fell completely silent. He turned towards Serenity. "And that's why," he said, voice low but sure, "I'm not just her neighbor, or her friend, or her business partner." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. Sleek, matte black, no velvet or sparkle. Just truth. "I'm her fiancé." Gasps erupted. Several people applauded instinctively. Others simply froze. Serenity's heart slammed into her chest. Her hand covered her mouth, not from fear but from the flood of emotion that crashed through her. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't performative. Christian wasn't asking a question. He was making a declaration. She stepped forward, eyes wet but steady, and nodded. Once that was all she needed to say. The applause surged. Phones lifted. Flashes blinked. Laughter spilled across the room. Even the uncomfortable ones. Tom Mildred, the councilwoman in the corner, found themselves smiling in spite of themselves. But one person didn't clap. Susan. She stood up slowly, eyes locked on Serenity, her expression hardening with something that wasn't jealousy. It was disbelief. Rage disguised as surprise. The crowd, caught in the euphoria of the moment, didn't notice her slip out. But Serenity did. She watched Susan vanish into the night, her figure swallowed by the snow-covered street. The music started again. People danced. Plates were passed around. The gala lived on. But inside Serenity, a new awareness bloomed. Because when she stepped out onto her front porch for a breath of air, her phone vibrated again. A second message. From a burner account. No profile picture. No name. Just 6 words. "You're not safe. Not yet. K." Serenity's gaze lifted to the street, where a single black SUV idled across from her home, engine running, windows tinted, and a camera pointed straight at her front door. The announcement settled over the room like a velvet storm, soft in sound, but seismic in effect. Christian's voice had barely landed before the room broke into an awkward mixture of gasps, applause, and stunned silence. Some guests clapped with genuine excitement, others out of social reflex, but many simply froze, caught between disbelief and discomfort, watching the moment reshape the balance of everything they thought they knew about the woman in front of them. Serenity stood near the grand piano, the chandelier light catching the shimmer of her gown, her hand still gently resting in Christian's. The ring on her finger glinted under the warm lights. Not oversized, not gaudy, but devastatingly elegant. It was a piece that said legacy, not performance. It was clear to everyone that this was not a stunt, not a ploy, not a headline-chasing romance. This was two people who had survived enough separately to finally choose to rise together. Susan's reaction didn't come in words. It came in the clench of her jaw, the trembling of her wine glass, the way she immediately looked to the HOA board members clustered in the corner of the room. Her grip on power had slipped by degrees over the past few weeks. But now, in front of city officials, cameras, journalists, and neighbors who had once blindly followed her lead, she her influence unravel publicly. And worse, with grace. Christian, sensing the weight of the moment, didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply held Serenity's hand higher for the crowd to see and added, "And since Greenwood Hills has been such a welcoming place, we figured we'd make it permanent. We'll be neighbors for a long time." Whispers swept through the room like wind through tall grass. Everyone turned their heads, trying to confirm what they just heard. Christian nodded toward the corner window, where through the glass you could just make out the outline of the mansion next door, one that had sat on the market quietly for nearly a year. "I closed on it yesterday," he said. "Private sale. No realtor involved. Susan, you really should check your emails more often." That line cut like glass. Susan's face went pale. Her composure cracked, but only slightly, just enough for those paying attention to see it. She set her glass down on the table with a soft but deliberate clink and disappeared into the back hallway, flanked by the zoning official and one of her trusted board members. But Serenity didn't follow her. She didn't need to. The battlefield had shifted, and Susan's retreat was as loud as any protest. The room buzzed for the next hour, conversations folding over each other like ripples. Christian made his rounds calmly, shaking hands, engaging with city leaders, answering a few cautious questions from reporters. Serenity stayed close to her community, the ones who had supported her, the ones who had shown up when it would have been easier to stay silent. The house, once targeted as foreign, now pulsed with belonging. She could feel it in the floorboards, in the clinking glasses, in the way people danced, not because they were at a party, but because they were witnessing history on their block. And still, underneath it all, there was tension. Some guests smiled with their teeth only. Some hugged her too tightly, with performative grace. Some neighbors slipped out quietly. No goodbye, no plate, no warmth. The war hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. It was nearly midnight when Serenity finally retreated to her foyer, taking a moment to herself. She stood by the front door, one hand on the glass pane, looking out onto the now empty street. Snow had begun falling again, soft and rhythmic. The air inside was still humming with music and celebration, but here in this quiet corner there was stillness, reflection. She let out a long breath, a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. That's when she heard it, the soft slide of paper against wood. It came from the floor. She looked down. A folded piece of paper had been slipped under the door. Her heart seized. Instinct kicked in. She bent slowly, picked it up, and turned it over. No name, no envelope. Just a single sheet, folded twice. She opened it with steady fingers. The message was typed, all caps. "You think you've won, but we know who you really are. This neighborhood isn't yours, not yet. Watch yourself." No signature, no return address. Just that voice, cold, rehearsed, familiar. Serenity blinked slowly, the corners of her jaw tightening. She wasn't surprised. She was prepared, but the cruelty still cut. She read it again, then folded it carefully, and slid it into her clutch. Christian found her there moments later, his brow furrowed as soon as he saw her expression. "What happened?" She handed him the note, silently. He read it, said nothing for a long beat. Then finally, "They're scared." She nodded. "And dangerous." Christian looked up at her. "We'll handle it." "No," she said, her voice low. "I'll handle it. I've come too far to let a note turn me back into a shadow." He didn't argue. He simply offered his arm. "Then let's walk back in, like the storm we are." They turned to rejoin the guests, but just before they stepped back into the party, Serenity glanced out the peephole instinctively. The street was still, until she noticed it. A set of boot prints, fresh, deep, leading from the edge of the block straight to her door, but no one had knocked. And when she followed the trail with her eyes, she saw them stop at a black SUV, the same one from earlier, but this time, it wasn't empty. The back door cracked open, just for a second, long enough for her to see the face. Kevin Marks, her neighbor, the one who never spoke, the one who never smiled, the one whose name was now linked to a new complaint, the one she hadn't yet had time to read. And just as Serenity reached for her phone to call security, A notification popped up. Lawsuit filed. Kevin Marks v. Serenity Vaughn, alleging defamation and emotional distress. The note sat on the kitchen island like a bruise. Small, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Serenity had placed it there after the guests left, after the music faded, and the house finally exhaled. The paper itself was ordinary, torn from a cheap notepad, the edges uneven, as if ripped in haste. But the words carved into it were anything but casual. They were handwritten, blocky, heavy with pressure, the kind of writing that came from a hand gripping a pen too tightly. Go back where you came from. 4 words. No signature. No flourish. Just a sentence designed to reduce her to something temporary, removable, unwanted. Christian stood across from her, jaw tight, eyes flicking between the note and the front door, as if the threat might materialize again if he looked away. He suggested calling security immediately, his voice low and controlled. He spoke of patrols, cameras, legal steps. He spoke like someone who knew how quickly situations could turn when hatred felt entitled to privacy. Serenity listened without interrupting, her fingers resting flat against the counter, feeling the cool stone ground her. No, she said finally, not yet. Christian searched her face, trying to read the resolve forming there. Serenity, this crossed a line. I know, she replied. That's why I'm not going to bury it. She picked up the note, turned it once more in her hands, and felt something shift. Not fear, not even anger, but clarity. Whoever slipped this under her door believed darkness was protection. They believed anonymity would keep them safe. Serenity had spent too many years watching harm hide behind politeness, behind systems, behind silence. She was done allowing cruelty to operate unseen. She took a photo of the note, careful to capture the texture of the paper, the indentation of the pen strokes, the way the letters bit into the page. She didn't crop it. She didn't soften it. Then she sat at the dining table, phone glowing in the quiet house, and began to type. Her caption was simple. This was slipped under my door tonight. Same street. Same neighborhood. Same hate. If you think racism only looks loud, think again. She posted it without hashtags, without explanation, trusting the truth to carry itself. It did. Within minutes the post ignited. Comments flooded in from people who recognized the language immediately, who had received similar notes, messages, whispers, warnings dressed as advice. Others asked how someone could still write something like that in 2025, incredulous as if time alone should have cured malice. Screenshots traveled faster than Serenity could refresh the page. Influencers reposted it. Journalists reached out. The story, which had briefly shifted toward glamour and celebration after the engagement, snapped back to its raw center. Christian watched it unfold, his phone buzzing nonstop. This is going to escalate, he said quietly. Serenity nodded. It already has. At least now it's honest. As the night deepened, messages arrived from unexpected corners. A retired teacher from the block apologized for not speaking up sooner. A young couple who lived 2 streets over sent a private note offering support and their Ring camera footage if needed. Serenity read everything slowly, absorbing the mosaic of fear, guilt, solidarity, and resolve that formed around her. The house no longer felt quiet. It felt watched, but not just by enemies. Then, close to midnight, her phone chimed with a different kind of notification. A direct message from a neighbor she barely knew. The profile photo showed a middle-aged man standing beside a golden retriever, smiling awkwardly. His name was Martin Hale. He lived 3 houses down, on the corner, a place Serenity had passed dozens of times without ever exchanging more than a nod. I think I have something you should see, the message read. I didn't realize it mattered until I saw your post. Serenity's pulse quickened, but she kept her movements measured. She replied with a simple question. What is it? A few seconds passed. Then a video file appeared. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at Christian first. Someone has footage. Christian straightened. From when? I don't know. Open it, he said gently. I'm here. Serenity tapped the screen. The video began with a fisheye view of a quiet sidewalk dusted with snow, illuminated by a porch light. A timestamp glowed in the corner, earlier that evening, just after the toast, during the swell of music and applause. The camera angle was fixed, unmistakably a doorbell cam. The sound was muted at first, then adjusted as the clip stabilized. A figure entered the frame from the right, moving with purpose but not haste. They wore a dark coat, hood pulled low, shoulders squared. Serenity leaned closer, her breath shallow. The person paused at the edge of the porch, glanced toward the street, then knelt, a hand extended, sliding a folded piece of paper beneath the door, with a practiced motion. No hesitation. No stumble. Then the figure stood, and the hood slipped back just enough. Serenity's chest tightened. The camera caught the face in profile, clear and unmistakable under the porch light. Not a stranger, not a passerby, someone she had seen up close, someone she had welcomed inside her home, hours earlier, offered a drink, a smile, a plate of food. The video ended. For a moment, neither Serenity nor Christian spoke. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the house itself had absorbed the betrayal. Serenity replayed the clip once more, slower this time, her eyes tracing every frame, every movement. There was no doubt: the angle, the light, the face. It all aligned with sickening clarity. "It can't be," Christian murmured. Though the evidence offered no room for disbelief, Serenity closed her eyes, memories rearranging themselves with brutal efficiency. The smile at the doorway, the polite conversation about the weather, the compliment about the music selection. The way he had lingered near the front hall as if orienting himself. She had thought nothing of it then. Hospitality was reflexive to her, a language she spoke fluently. Now it felt weaponized. She opened her eyes. "He thanked me," she said quietly, "for the invite." Christian's jaw hardened. "We take this to the police." Serenity shook her head, not in refusal, but in recalibration. "We take it to the truth first." She typed back to Martin, thanking him and asking permission to share the footage publicly. His reply came quickly. "Yes, use it. I'm tired of pretending I didn't see things." Serenity didn't rush. She saved the video, backed it up, sent copies to Christian's legal team. Then she prepared another post. Her hands steady, her words precise. She didn't name the person. Not yet. She let the footage speak, let viewers recognize what she had recognized. The caption was shorter this time. "To whoever thought darkness would hide you, someone was watching." The response was immediate and explosive. Comments multiplied by the second, speculation giving way to recognition as neighbors began tagging one another, matching faces to names. The internet did what it always did when confronted with receipts. It assembled the puzzle faster than any institution ever could. Christian's phone rang again and again. Reporters, lawyers, friends. He answered only one call, listened briefly, then hung up. "The neighborhood forum is in chaos," he said. "They're turning on each other." Serenity felt no satisfaction in that. Only resolve. A new message appeared. This one from an unknown number. "You didn't have to do this." It read, "We could have talked." Serenity stared at the words, then deleted them without replying. Minutes later, another message arrived, longer this time, defensive, rambling. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. The night had stripped away any remaining illusions. Hatred didn't always come from the loudest voices. Sometimes it came wrapped in civility, smiling at your table, eating your food, waiting for the lights to dim. As dawn approached, the house grew quiet again. But the quiet was different now, alert, sharpened by awareness. Serenity stood by the window, watching the first hint of morning soften the snow. She felt tired, yes, but also anchored. The truth had weight. It changed rooms when you carried it through them. Her phone buzzed one last time. A message from Martin again, brief and careful. "There's more footage," he wrote, "from inside your house." Serenity's breath caught. "Inside?" she whispered. Christian turned toward her, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, inside?" She looked at the screen, the implications crashing in all at once. Inside meant access. Inside meant trust. Inside meant the betrayal went deeper. Then a note slipped under a door. She typed back with a single word, "Send it." The video that followed didn't show the porch. It showed Serenity's living room. Hours earlier, and the person standing closest to her smile was the same one now caught in the dark. The second video landed like a quiet explosion. It didn't shout. It didn't need to. The footage, pulled from Martin Hale's interior security system, installed after a break-in years earlier, showed Serenity's living room from a corner angle she had never noticed. The timestamp glowed faintly in the corner, anchoring the moment in undeniable fact. Music drifted through the frame, laughter rising and falling in warm waves, guests moving in and out of view with plates in hand. And then Kevin Marks stepped fully into frame, closer than anyone else to Serenity, close enough that his smile looked genuine, close enough that the camera captured the careful way he nodded while she spoke. the ease with which he accepted her hospitality. Kevin had blended seamlessly into the evening. He wore a pressed blazer and carried himself like someone who belonged anywhere. He had spoken about schools, about his kids' soccer schedules, about how refreshing it was to see community on the block again. He had thanked Serenity for the invite, complimented the food, laughed at the right moments. The camera caught it all. What it also caught, what made Serenity's stomach hollow, was the subtle shift after their conversation ended. Kevin lingered near the hallway, eyes scanning the room, attention sharpening. He checked his phone, slipped it back into his pocket, then moved toward the front door with a purpose that had nothing to do with leaving early. Serenity watched the clip without blinking. She didn't need to see the rest to know how it ended. The porch footage had already filled in the blanks. Still, she watched until the end, forcing herself to witness the betrayal in full. When the video cut to black, the silence that followed felt louder than the gala ever had. Christian stood beside her, one hand braced on the back of a chair, his face set in a way she had only seen when he was making decisions that could not be undone. "He planned it," Christian said quietly. "This wasn't impulse." Serenity nodded. "He wanted to feel close first." They moved carefully after that, deliberate and precise. The footage was shared with Christian's legal team, with a civil rights attorney who specialized in harassment cases, with the journalist who had covered the gala, and now understood the story had taken a darker turn. Serenity didn't rush to post the interior footage immediately. She knew timing mattered. She knew exposure without context could be twisted. Instead, she prepared a statement, measured, factual, restrained, explaining that a neighbor who had attended her event had been caught on camera delivering a racist threat to her home later that night. She didn't name Kevin at first. The internet did it for her. Within hours, people recognized him. A few locals tagged his profile. Someone unearthed an old neighborhood newsletter, featuring his family smiling in matching sweaters. Another posted a screenshot of his earlier comment on the forum complaining about outsiders and values. The narrative crystallized with brutal speed. Kevin Marks became the face of something the neighborhood had long pretended wasn't there. The polite racist. The man who shook your hand and smiled while planning how to put you back in your place. Kevin responded the next morning, not with an apology, not with reflection, but with outrage. He posted a long defensive statement on his personal page, claiming he had been misrepresented and targeted by an online mob. He said the note was a private expression of concern, that Serenity had provoked the neighborhood with her social media presence, that his family was now receiving threats because of her. He framed himself as the victim, wounded by exposure, humiliated by context. Serenity read the post once, then closed it. She had learned the futility of arguing with a narrative designed to protect itself. By noon, a formal complaint was filed with the police. Not against Kevin, for the note, for the harassment, for the trespass, but against Serenity. The charge alleged defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Kevin claimed she had ruined his reputation, endangered his children, and caused him severe psychological harm by posting footage that, according to his attorney, was obtained without consent and weaponized for personal gain. The irony was suffocating. Christian read the filing twice, his jaw tightening. "They're suing you," he said flatly, "for being honest." Serenity felt the familiar heat behind her eyes, but she didn't let it spill. "Of course they are." The lawsuit moved quickly. Kevin's attorney filed in county court, requesting an injunction to force Serenity to remove the footage and issue a public apology. The filing was thick with language about privacy, about family values, about reputational damage. It avoided the word racism entirely, skirting the truth with practiced precision. It framed Serenity as reckless, vindictive, attention-seeking. It suggested that her platform had become a weapon. The response from the public was swift and divided. Many rallied around Serenity, fundraising for legal costs, sharing their own stories of being targeted after speaking out. Others, some from Greenwood Hills, others from farther away, echoed Kevin's talking points. They asked why she hadn't gone to the police quietly. They questioned her motives. They warned about trial by internet. The same people who had doubted her ownership now doubted her right to defend herself. Serenity met with her attorney that evening, a woman named Dana Brooks, whose calm competence felt like ballast. Dana listened without interrupting, flipping through the filings, marking pages with practiced ease. When Serenity finished, Dana leaned back and folded her hands. "The case is thin," she said, "painfully thin. But that doesn't mean it won't be loud." Serenity nodded. "I'm not afraid of loud." Dana smiled faintly. "Good, because they're counting on you to be." Kevin, meanwhile, retreated behind statements and surrogates. He stopped answering calls. He kept his children home from school for a week, then sent a carefully worded message to the PTA about safety concerns. His wife deactivated her social media accounts. The narrative he crafted was meticulous. A good family man, unfairly attacked by a powerful influencer. It ignored the footage. It ignored the note. It ignored the fear his actions had caused. But it found an audience eager to believe him. The court date was set for early January. A hearing first, then, if the judge allowed it, a full trial. Kevin's attorney requested a jury, confident that the language of hurt feelings and reputational damage would play well. Serenity didn't object. She didn't want a quiet dismissal. She wanted the truth examined under oath. The night before the hearing, Serenity sat alone in her living room, the same room where Kevin had smiled and nodded and planned. The house felt different now, not violated, but alert. She thought about the risk she had taken by opening her doors, by believing that hospitality could soften prejudice. She didn't regret it, but she understood the cost more clearly now. Christian joined her, setting 2 mugs on the table. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. She met his gaze. "I know, but I have to do it myself." The first day of court arrived cold and gray. The courthouse loomed like an institution that had seen this story in many variations. Serenity walked in with her attorney, her posture straight, her expression composed. Kevin arrived separately, flanked by counsel, eyes forward, jaw set. He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. The room already knew how to hold them apart. Procedural matters moved quickly. Motions were read. Objections noted. The judge, impassive, set the tone. Then Kevin's attorney rose for a preliminary statement. His voice smooth, confident. "This case," he began, "is about what happens when power meets irresponsibility." Serenity listened, unmoving, as the narrative unfurled. She was described as reckless, as someone who had chosen notoriety over neighborliness. The footage was framed as invasive, the note as misguided but private. Kevin was painted as a man overwhelmed by a storm he never intended to create. Then the attorney paused, turned a page, and looked up. And to demonstrate a pattern of behavior, he said, "The defense will call a witness who knows Ms. Vaughn well. Someone from her past who can speak to her character and her tendency to escalate conflicts." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Serenity's breath caught. Dana's pen stilled mid-note. The attorney named the witness, a name Serenity had not heard in years, a name that pulled her backward into a chapter she had closed with effort and scars. Dana leaned toward her, voice low. "Did you expect that?" Serenity shook her head, her pulse thudding in her ears. She stared straight ahead as the implications settled. Someone she had trusted once. Someone who knew her before Greenwood Hills, before the cameras, before the armor. The bailiff called for order. The judge nodded for proceedings to continue. Serenity folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself. Whatever Kevin thought he had uncovered, whatever version of her past he intended to parade, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The truth did not become a lie just because someone else told it first. As the courtroom doors opened for the witness to enter, Serenity finally turned and recognized the face she had hoped never to see again. Serenity's heart didn't pound. It thundered, not with fear, not with fury, but with the cold, creeping sensation that something inside her was being unearthed without her consent. The courtroom had quieted, the air charged like static before lightning, as everyone watched the doors at the far end open slowly. When the bailiff stepped aside, it wasn't just a witness entering. It was a ghost from a chapter she had long sealed away, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Jessica Doyle. Jessica didn't walk with hesitation. She strode forward with that polished confidence some people carry when they know their truth is protected by privilege. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her suit crisp, her gaze sharp against a gallery of strangers who stared with equal parts curiosity and confusion. Serenity's stomach twisted, not with recognition at first, but with the unnatural familiarity of someone who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in dorm rooms, smoke-filled lounges, and late-night dining halls. When Jessica reached the stand, she didn't pause. She didn't glance at Serenity. Instead, she offered a polite nod to the judge and raised her right hand, obediently. Serenity watched in stunned silence. As the courtroom clerk administered the oath, Jessica's voice steady, rehearsed. The defense attorney wasted no time. "Ms. Doyle," he said gently, "were you ever personally acquainted with Serenity Vaughn?" Jessica's response was swift. "Yes. We were college roommates for 2 years." Serenity's breath hitched. She remembered Jessica, not fondly, not maliciously, but enough. They had shared a dorm suite during sophomore year. Jessica was popular, the kind of student who slipped into leadership roles effortlessly. Serenity had admired her once, before admiration turned to disillusionment. They had split not with anger, but with silence, a quiet drift that carried the weight of unspoken words. During your time together, the attorney prompted, did you ever witness Miss Vaughn act in a hostile or threatening manner toward you? Jessica's lips curved into a thoughtful smile, the kind that was too smooth, too polished to be honest. Yes, she said. There was an incident during our sophomore year. We had an argument over a group project. I felt threatened by how she articulated her frustration. It wasn't physical, but it was intense. It made me uncomfortable. Serenity closed her eyes, the memory surfacing like a bitter wind. The argument had been heated, but it was about creative differences and deadlines, the kind of tension that flares between people who care too much about grades. The idea that Jessica, someone who had always been dramatic, would classify it as a threat now, years later, felt like a betrayal encoded in time. The defense attorney leaned in slightly. And this incident occurred when? October of our sophomore year, Jessica replied smoothly. Did you report this at the time? No, she said, her gaze drifting to the jury, as if she expected them to understand why not reporting a concern somehow validated her later testimony. The attorney nodded. Thank you, Miss Doyle. Serenity's jaw tightened. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. But inside, her composure was cracking. Not because of what was being said, but because of the way old memories could be manipulated into ammunition when placed in the wrong hands. Her attorney, Dana Brooks, rose slowly, her voice calm but firm. Ms. Doyle, is it accurate to say that this alleged incident occurred more than a decade ago, in a private setting between two students? Yes, Jessica answered without hesitation, and that no charges, no reports, no witnesses beyond yourself were ever involved at that time. Isn't it true, Dana continued, that disagreements among college roommates happen frequently, often without malice or intention to harm? Jessica swallowed, visibly, her practiced confidence flickering. I suppose. You suppose, Dana pressed, that the tension you felt was frustration, not a threat. I felt uncomfortable. No one else felt threatened. Correct? Jessica paused. The judge interrupted with a gentle reminder about sticking to the question. The room hummed with the breathless tension of words hanging midair. Serenity watched the exchange, her gaze steady until the pressure built so severe that it felt like ice threading through her veins. She had walked into this courtroom prepared to defend her actions, to expose the racism and hypocrisy that had spawned Kevin's lawsuit. She had not walked in prepared for someone she once knew, someone who had once shared her food, her space, her laughter, to stand here and twist a memory into a weapon. Dana sat down, her face measured. Serenity appreciated Dana's composure, but still, a crack had formed, an almost imperceptible shift in Serenity's armor. She wasn't shaken by the memory itself. She was shaken by the betrayal of context, how history could be reframed by perspective, how truth could be molded like clay in the hands of someone who wanted a different ending. As Jessica returned to her seat, a murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Some jurors looked thoughtfully at Serenity, eyebrows arched as if they had just seen a familiar riddle in a new light. Others stared blankly, unsure of what to make of decades-old grievances pulled into a present battle. Serenity met Christian's eyes across the courtroom. He stood near the gallery, hand clasped over his chest like a silent anchor. He didn't frown. He didn't gasp. He only gave her a look filled with quiet strength. A reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Then something unexpected happened. A commotion stirred in the gallery, near the back bench. A woman stood abruptly, not loud, not dramatic, but with a certainty that drew every eye. The courtroom murmured, as one breath, curiosity, confusion, shock building in the space between the walls. Serenity turned her head, her heart catching. The woman wasn't a stranger. Serenity knew that face. Not from Greenwood Hills. Not from the gallery, but from a photograph she had seen only once, years earlier, during a darker time she had worked hard to forget. The woman took a step forward, her voice steady but edged with urgency. Your Honor, she said plainly, I have something that needs to be heard. The courtroom gasped. The judge paused, pen hovering above the docket. Kevin and his attorney blinked in surprise. Dana leaned forward, her gaze sharp with calculation. Christian's breath slowed, his posture resolute. And Serenity, feeling something raw and unexpected ripple through her ribs like wind through hollow bones. Recognized the woman fully. She was someone whose name shouldn't have mattered anymore, but now did. A woman from her past whose appearance here tonight would unravel more than just testimony. Her mother. The courtroom exhaled as Serenity's mother stepped fully into view. Eyes locked on her daughter, and then on Jessica Doyle, preparing to speak words that would change everything. The courtroom seemed impossibly still, like a held breath that had forgotten how to exhale. Serenity's mother, standing in the back row, had opened a door that shouldn't have been there, but it did, and the room felt its presence like an electric current. Just when the testimony against her had twisted a memory into something ugly, something weaponized, a different figure rose from the far corner of the gallery, a tall man in a tweed jacket, gentle gray at the temples, with a dignity that filled the courtroom in the quietest way. He was Serenity's former college professor, Dr. Malcolm Hawthorne, the very person who had witnessed the argument Jessica Doyle had now turned into alleged evidence of temperament, threat, or ill intent. When Dr. Hawthorne took the stand, the courtroom leaned in without realizing it. His voice, seasoned by decades of teaching and grounded in memory, carried a calm authority that made people listen without sneering or doubt. "I remember that evening," he began, "because it was not an argument born of malice. It was a debate, passionate, yes, but intellectual, not personal." Serenity expressed frustration over an unfair distribution of workload in a group project, and that is a very common occurrence in academic life. "I stepped in, diffused the situation, and there was no threat made, no escalation beyond a difference of opinion." The room seemed to exhale as Dr. Hawthorne continued, recounting the details with precision. He described how both students had apologized to one another afterward, how the episode had been resolved among peers without incident, and how Jessica herself had laughed about it later at a class gathering. He spoke not to defend Serenity but to clarify the truth, and in doing so he exposed the hollow foundation of Jessica's courtroom testimony. The defense attorney's face fell. The same confident mask that had carried him through the opening remarks quivered slightly. The jurors exchanged looks of curiosity and reconsideration. When Jessica took the stand again, her eyes weren't sharp or confident. They flickered with doubt, like a candle in a draft. Under Dr. Hawthorne's implied refutation, her narrative unraveled. Serenity watched all of this in a strange stillness. Not triumphant, not relieved, but tempered by the years of knowing that truth and justice were rarely the same thing. Even now, with the facts laid bare, she waited for resistance, for denial, for some counterattack that might salvage the credibility of a lie crafted to hurt her. But nothing came. Jessica's testimony, once polished and piercing, now sagged with the embarrassment of contradiction. Kevin's attorney tried to pivot to frame Dr. Hawthorne's testimony as biased or irrelevant, but the judge, attentive and perceptive, cut him off with a gentle firmness that signaled the end was near. The courtroom's focus narrowed, the tension shifting from confrontation to resolution. When the final arguments concluded, Serenity sat with her mother and Christian just behind her legal team. They spoke in whispers, words of support, of careful praise for how she'd carried herself, of how her strength seemed born of something ancient and enduring. Serenity didn't respond much. Her gaze was steady, locked on the judge's bench, where decisions and futures lingered in balances unseen by everyone else in the gallery. The jury left to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied into a reverent hush. Serenity's mother offered her a small smile, tired, proud, quietly relieved. Christian squeezed her hand, not to steady her, but to stand beside her. No words were necessary. The hours crawled like winter shadows, and then finally the jury returned. All eyes turned. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and in measured tones, delivered the words that lifted months of tension in a single breath. "We find in favor of the defendant, Miss Serenity Vaughn. The claims of defamation and emotional distress are without sufficient basis, and this court dismisses the complaint with prejudice." The room exhaled in waves, some loud, some quiet. Serenity felt the tension drain out of her body, like water slipping from a tight fist. She didn't shout. She didn't weep. She simply sat still, absorbing the truth of her name, being affirmed in a place that had tried so hard to erase it. When the gavel finally came down, marking the end of the trial, Christian stood and offered his arm to Serenity's mother first, an old-fashioned gesture that made her smile widely. Serenity gathered her things slowly, her mother by her side, the lawyer giving them nods of respect and encouragement. As they walked toward the exit, journalists and courtroom attendees murmured, "Congratulations," asked questions, and shook hands. Someone snapped a photo, a moment that felt more like dawn than conclusion. But just at the courthouse doors, a tense quiet fell over Serenity again. Susan Whitmore stood there, frozen like a portrait in place, her posture rigid, her eyes trained on Serenity with something that wasn't remorse, or even neutrality, something colder. Susan had tracked her to the courthouse, remaining unseen until this final moment, when her presence seemed designed to land like a dropped pin in the middle of a sacred space. Serenity approached with her mother and Christian just behind, careful not to look away before acknowledging Susan's confrontation. The hallway, usually so sterile and bureaucratic, felt heavy, as if every step carried the weight of every injustice that had happened here. Susan's voice was low, nearly drowned out by the hushed crowd, only loud enough for Serenity to hear. "You think this changes everything?" she said, her tone tight, brittle. "You think a judge's verdict fixes what happens in real life?" Serenity met her gaze, unwavering. "It changes what matters most. Truth. It changes what is acceptable. It changes how history remembers this street." Susan didn't blink. Instead, her eyes narrowed, and her next words slithered out with a quiet venom that chilled the air around them. "This isn't over. You think people forgive easily? You think community means acceptance? Let me tell you something. You're alone out here." Serenity didn't respond immediately. She let the words hang there, unclaimed, unacknowledged, as if refusing them gave them less power. Her mother reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Christian stood at her side, silent but present, offering a solidity that Susan clearly had never understood. Then Susan turned, but before she fully walked away, she paused, not to reconsider, not to apologize, but to whisper one final insult aimed to wound deeper than any legal verdict ever could. "Enjoy your hollow victory." The words trailed off, barely audible, but in a place steeped with attention, they landed with a subtle echo. Serenity stood still for a moment, letting them settle in the air before she stepped forward into the light of the courthouse exit. Behind her, reporters called questions she didn't answer. Ahead, a future she had fought tooth and nail to protect waited, unmapped, unfiltered, and undeniably real. But as she moved, a single reporter, one she had not seen before, approached with a voice softer than the rest, a presence less hungry for outrage and more for truth. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, holding out a recorder. "The verdict was historic. But what about the note? The threat? They're calling it a turning point for local housing discrimination awareness. Do you think this changes how neighborhoods like Greenwood Hills see people like you?" Serenity paused. She didn't speak immediately, choosing instead to feel the momentum of every step that had led here. Her voice eventually emerged, steady but layered.
"This case wasn't just about a verdict," she said. "It was about people being seen for who they truly are. Not the fears projected onto them, not the biases sewn into policy, but their actual humanity. If this changes how even one family feels about their neighbors, then yes, this matters."
The reporter nodded, but before he could follow with another question, another voice rose, feral in its curiosity, sharp in its proximity. "Miss Vaughn," it called. Serenity turned. Standing in the crowd was someone she hadn't expected, a name she thought had faded into a different life altogether. A journalist from the Metro Observer 5, who had covered the gala. The same journalist who had recorded footage of Susan sneering at the party. Only now, with press credentials visible, she stepped forward, her expression serious and intense. "Serenity," she said, "we uncovered something during the trial you might want to see." Serenity blinked. She didn't answer. She simply took the reporter's outstretched phone, and as she read the news article headline, written in bold, stark letters, her chest tightened not with fear but with the undeniable realization that her fight was far from over. The words on the screen didn't just change the public narrative, they rewrote an entire chapter of Greenwood Hills history. The headline read, "Exclusive newly uncovered documents reveal decades-long pattern of racially selective zoning in Greenwood Hills." But the most shocking name on the files just changed everything. The winter sunlight that Christmas season was pale and gentle, barely warming the snow-dusted lawns of Greenwood Hills. But inside Serenity Vaughn's home, a glow that had nothing to do with lights pulsed through every room. She had become, without pretense or design, something much larger than a neighbor with a beautiful house. She had become a living contradiction to the quiet prejudice that had once branded her homeless simply for walking up her own sidewalk. That designation was now something people said aloud only when they were trying to shame themselves into silence. Months had passed since the courtroom's quiet, thunderous verdict. Life outside the press releases and hashtags had blossomed into tangible purpose. Serenity and Christian had moved forward, not by forgetting the fight, but by channeling it into something that knit their power with the needs of others. Together they launched the Foundation for Equitable Housing Opportunities, a nonprofit aimed at dismantling the bureaucratic and cultural barriers that enforced segregation and biased policing. Barriers Serenity had felt on her own skin long before her neighbors had ever seen her face. The Foundation's headquarters was a refurbished brownstone in downtown. The walls adorned with images of families awarded justice, portraits of community leaders who had fought silent battles all their lives, and a permanent display memorializing the case that had shifted a county's perspective. Volunteers arrived each morning before the sun fully rose, coffee mugs in hand, ready to counsel, strategize, write grants, and offer training on how to protect rights in hostile communities where bias lived quietly in bylaws and whispers. "Never in my life," Serenity said one morning, folding her coat and stepping into the triage room, where legal teams met residents seeking help. "Did I imagine this kind of work would be my life's mission?" Christian was beside her then, white tea in hand, eyes warm. "You never asked for this," he said softly. "But now that it found you, it found the right home," which was precisely why their wedding invitation list was not long, but deeply intentional. It included activists who had stood beside them, lawyers who fought quietly for justice before it became trending news, and families who had found dignity through the Foundation's early work. Some invitations went to families like Tom and Mildred, neighbors who had publicly acknowledged their own preconceived biases, and then stepped into accountability. Invitations went to leaders of historically underserved communities. Several went to journalists whose coverage balanced truth with compassion. One envelope was not delivered. Susan Whitmore's, not by mistake, not by oversight, but by deliberate choice, because Serenity had learned through her journey that exclusion is only painful when it's rooted in fear. She did not wish Susan well, and she did not wish her harm. She simply wished Susan clarity, and an absence from an event, rooted in healing, would speak louder than any welcome could. Months of tireless work culminated in an annual equity gala, hosted at the Foundation's headquarters. The event brought elected officials, community organizers, scholars, residents impacted by discriminatory policies, and even a few hesitant neighbors from Greenwood Hills who had begun privately reaching out through community forums with questions that had once been unthinkable. What can I do? How can I support? What have we ignored? At one point, Serenity found herself at the center of the crowded room, a gentle hum of conversation folding into the brass of a string quartet. A young couple who had been denied housing because of discriminatory zoning laws stood at her elbow, their eyes wet with gratitude, as they shared how the Foundation's legal aid had changed the course of their lives. Serenity listened with a humble smile. Someone approached her then, an older black man in a tailored coat, his eyes bright with recognition. "You don't know me," he said, voice thick, "but you changed everything for my daughter. She finally got her first home in a place that felt like possibility, not threat." Serenity felt her own eyes sting, just a bit. "That's why we do it," she replied simply. He nodded, a deep, understanding gesture. Across the room, Christian watched from a small group, looking at Serenity, not with the pride that bursts in loud moments, but with the quiet warmth of someone who knew every unpublicized hour of effort behind this life they were building together. Their hands brushed. Neither needed to speak. They already shared the words their hearts carried. And yet, even in these months of forward motion, Greenwood Hills remained a complex tapestry of progress and resistance. People changed differently. Some with eagerness, some unwillingly, some only in private murmurs, some not at all. Serenity heard about dinner table conversations where her name was spoken harshly in tones of fear. She learned neighbors began hosting meetings about how to preserve community character in ways that sounded softer than before, but aimed at the same exclusionary end. The email threads she had once been removed from resurfaced with polite language and sanitized concerns about property values. But she had learned that euphemisms are often just hatred with a bow. Still, there were moments of surprising openness. One afternoon, Tom and Mildred stood on her porch again, not unannounced this time, but hesitant. Serenity greeted them with the same warmth she offered everyone, innate hospitality guiding her steps. Mildred clasped her hands together, voice wavering. "Serenity," she said. "We've been wrong about so much. Not just about you, but about what we believed was truth. I had no idea how deeply this all went." Serenity didn't respond with rebuke. She responded with grace. Precisely because the movement she built was not about adding guilt to hearts, but about lifting limitations from minds. "Thank you," she said. "Understanding is a beginning. Change is a practice." Mildred nodded, tears threatening. Tom stood quietly behind her, eyes at once regretful and hopeful. Not every change came easily. Not every heart opened fully. But pieces of this once fragile place were shifting. Months bled into seasons. Christmas approached again, in a way that felt different than before, quieter, wiser, a bit more ironic. The shadows of last December still lingered in memory, distinct in contrast to the life now unfolding. Snow began to fall gently, dusting the streets not with judgment this time, but with that soft hush of reflection that cold seasons bring. Greenwood Hills had changed in the margins, not with whistles and sirens, but with conversations in living rooms, at PTA meetings, in zoning committee hearings. Some meetings were cordial, others were fraught, but they were occurring where silence had once reigned. Then, shortly before Christmas, a report came through the Foundation's legal desk, land records. Uploaded in public domain, revealing a shift on Chestnut Lane. Serenity's breath caught when she saw the map. Susan Whitmore's house, once pristine, once steadfast in its unspoken assertion of exclusivity, now bore a bright for sale sign planted firmly in its front yard, the red lettering sharp against the winter white. Christian stood beside her, in the Foundation's small office, when she first gasped at the image, lips parting in awe, not because of triumph, but because of how quickly winters can reshape landscapes. She didn't cheer, she didn't smile widely. The moment felt like poetry. Susan's departure was not a vindictive end. It was a quiet testament to movement, though no one could yet say why she was selling. Rumors would swirl, of course. Some would claim financial decisions. Some would whisper discomfort with changing demographics. Some would suggest guilt visited her in the quiet of her own home. But Serenity didn't need rumors. She needed nothing from Susan anymore. Not closure, not apology, not approval. What she had was momentum. What she had was community. What she had was tangible change. A few days later, Serenity and Christian sent out their holiday letters, short but powerful. A recap of the Foundation's work. Stories of homes saved, families empowered, laws in motion, invitations to support systemic change. Each letter closed not with platitudes, but with a promise. Community transformed begins with courage witnessed and truth spoken. That Christmas Eve, as snow swirled outside like slow-motion confetti, Serenity stood inside her living room, now furnished with warmth, with art, with history. A small fire burned in the hearth. Christian placed a plate of spiced cookies on the coffee table. "Your favorite," he said, voice soft. She smiled, a gentle sort of smile carried by people who know battle, sacrifice, and the beauty of rising. They sipped hot tea, listening as orchestral jazz played faintly through the speakers. The quiet wasn't empty. It was rich with new beginnings. The phone buzzed once, a notification from a community group listing. Curious, she opened it. The top post read, Chestnut Lane Homeowner Association, new charter proposal. Her pulse quickened, not with dread, but with that familiar edge of anticipation. Below the headline was the first line of the proposed charter rewrite. Any homeowner sale impacting neighborhood composition shall be reviewed for equity and inclusion impact. It wasn't just a bylaw. It was a shift in power. Someone had introduced a motion that could make discriminatory practices unenforceable in Greenwood Hills. And the name attached to the motion? Mildred Thompson. Serenity blinked slowly, breath rising and falling in rhythm. Because change, after all, does not roar. It ripples. It persists. It arrives in the softest of snowfalls, quiet, categorical, and utterly transformed. As Serenity scrolled down the proposal, she noticed one more name at the bottom of the motion. Someone she never expected. Someone who had remained silent throughout all the battles. Susan Whitmore, co-sponsor. If you've ever been judged before being known, or silenced when you should have been seen, this story is for you. Type yes in the comments if you felt that sting of injustice, and tell us, what does belonging truly mean to you? Subscribe to stand with voices that won't be quiet anymore. Because stories like this don't just reveal the truth. They build the world we all deserve to live.